X, I'm sorry. Oh, no, they let the riffraff in here. We'll start in just a second here. All right, good evening. Thank you all for coming. I know 5 o'clock on a Wednesday? I have the Diamondbacks World Series has totally thrown my sense of time and day here, but I appreciate everybody coming out. This is a topic, or these are topics that's sort of important to all of us. And to be honest, my first reaction when I walked up here was the amount of men that are in this room, and I think that's awesome, because I think a lot of what we're talking about, there's great value in men learning about this and also being supportive of it. So I really do appreciate seeing all the people. So this is what we call Cronkite Live event, and the topic obviously is gender exclusivity in sports, inclusivity in sports, excuse me. I'll discuss what we're going to talk about in a minute, but I first want to introduce our panelists. So we will start, if I can find my notes, but I can wing it anyway. Lisa Olson at the far end. Lisa is probably one of the finest sports columnists in the country. I truly believe that. She's also a faculty associate here at ASU. She will be able to discuss a lot about sort of the transition and what has happened with women in sports media. We'll get into it later, but she was sort of at the center of a very high-profile case involving women in sports media, and it sort of dramatically altered her life, so we're going to get into that in just a few minutes. I also want to introduce Victoria Jackson, sitting there in the middle. Some of you may know her. She is a sports historian. She's got those fancy MA, PhDs here from ASU, but was also a collegiate athlete. Still holds the ASU track record for the 5,000 and has an NCAA title in the 10,000. Very accomplished and has done so much research and can offer such great perspective on a lot of topics that we're talking about. Right here is Taylor Hadley, who was Cronkite grad just a couple months ago. Now working for PHNX Sports. And Taylor was a master's student here, and I just really wanted her up here because when I was asking people in the Sports Bureau to write stories about transgender athletes, nobody would raise their hand except Taylor, and I was always really impressed that she was really willing to tackle those stories. And so we're gonna hit a variety of topics. I mentioned sort of the participation of trans athletes in women's sports. That's an important one. Women in sports media, and then also the advancement for female athletes. I was joking with this group just a few minutes ago because I kept running into these stories that 2023 was the year of the women in sports, and all these advancements had happened. And these articles made it sound like everything was kind of perfect now, and I don't think we're quite there yet. So, but I wanted to jump in, and Victoria, I'm going to lean on you a little bit. This issue about trans athletes and participation in sports is a hot-button topic, and we know it's politically divided people. I know that when Taylor wrote her article, she got quite a bit of feedback. Some of it wasn't pretty, and it's not a simple issue. And so before we kind of dive into it, Victoria, if you don't mind, sort of give us a historical perspective of this issue.
You guys ready for a history lecture? I'm just kidding. I'm cheesy, so know that. So if we're talking about modern sports, we need to historicize it, and modern sports have a specific history and an origin moment, which is the turn of the 19th to 20th century. So the modern Olympic movement, all of the modern sports that we recognize as the sports that we play, baseball, basketball, American football, all of them are born in this moment. And there are ideas in that moment from the people organizing sports that this is something that is exclusive and elite. So the International Olympic Committee is made up of a bunch of like barons and titled dudes in mostly Western Europe, and they want like this cool club where they get to play games together and call themselves Olympic champions. And it's this kind of exclusive elitist origin of the Olympic movement, which then spreads and grows and is organized hierarchically in a very top-down manner that kind of drives global sports policy from, you know, the 1890s forward. Those modern Olympics were for men only. So this exclusive elitist sports organization had one category of competition. And, you know, all the people forced out of sport in this moment, or, you know, official organized sport, they like to play games. I love to play games. I assume many of you do too. And so they start organizing their own events on the margins, on the sides. And eventually, you know, this history is one of exclusion and then fighting to gain access and then, you know, hopefully taking that access mission within sport and transforming broader society too. But you know, this second category of competition is a different way of thinking about the women's category than saying, you know, since the beginning of time, there's been two categories of competition in sport. That's not true. And so we can think of this in a way where that second category can be the inclusive one, right? If these were the folks who were pushed out, this is the space where everyone gets to play, everyone belongs. That model is very much what we see with the WNBA today, although not at the WNBA's origin moment, which, you know, is figuring out an identity to market and sell. And so the second category of competition, who is in charge of it? It's the same dudes, maybe their sons, but people with the same ideas about who gets to participate. And they're like fixated on policing the second category of competition and who is fit to participate. There's never been any sort of consideration of who is fit to participate in the men's category of competition. It's the women's one that has long been the focal point on, you know, proving your fitness to compete if you're woman enough to compete in the women's category.
Exactly. I mean, that's a mouthful, but there's a long history to what brings us to this point. And what's complicated the issue recently, I think, is that there have been some strong voices, female voices in sports that have raised some important questions, and that includes, I think, Martina Navratilova. And the argument is often, you know, that trans women have unfair physical advantages over those that are born female. And that's a whole nother deep dive we can take. But you know, and I know, Taylor, when you wrote your story, you sort of dived a little bit into the chemistry of it, but it's not a simple topic, is it? I mean, it's not just this is how it is and that's how it is. And so I know when you wrote this story about the athletes, I imagine you got a lot of pushback or feedback, or what did you get?
Is this on, Haj? It is on. Yeah, so when I wrote my story, I mean, I was still here at Cronkite, just like all of you are. I'm rather young. I'm in my first year of really being a journalist, and I was writing this story on transgender rights and, you know, the biology behind it, not just opinionated, but kind of taking this deep dive. And people didn't want to talk to me about it. I had a lot of pushback. I had a lot of people say they're scared that their reputation will be tarnished if they speak on the half, and I include their quotes in my story. I had a lot of people email me that my questions were very opinionated, even though I had worked with Paola, I had worked with several people on making sure that they weren't. So yeah, I mean, it's a tough topic because it's one that you can't please everybody in. And so I definitely got pushback throughout the entire process, and then I got several emails after it was published about my take being hateful, which was very much not where I was coming from. But it's hard to talk about, but it needs to be done. So I was glad that I could do it.
100%. And Victoria, when people bring up the whole biology argument, it's not that simple, is it? I mean, how do you sort of respond when people want to simply make it about biology?
Yeah, I defer to geneticists. And so, you know, one of the leading geneticists who is researching this and speaking out as much as he can about it, agreeing to all interviews and, you know, leading with science is Dr. Eric Villain. And he points out that, like, our bodies are unbelievably complicated and complex. Each of us, every single one of us, our genetic makeup, the way we produce and use those hormones and how these things change over time. And so what scientists are looking for is a disproportionate advantage. So that's the language that's more technical and removes kind of ideas of fairness, which are muddy, right? Talking about what's fair. I mean, nothing's fair in sports, right? There are so many factors that make some people more privileged than others. So talking about fairness or unfairness is completely useless when we're approaching this seriously. And so disproportionate advantage, well, how do we capture that? It's really complicated, and it varies from person to person and also throughout the course of a single person's lifetime. So putting this policy of testosterone is the hormone du jour in determining who is fit or unfit for the women's category. You know, and so what does that look like across each body? It's going to be different across each body. And, you know, it's in the past, it has been chromosomal cheek swabs. There's this effort to try to find a single factor that determines a difference between biological men's performance and biological women's performance, and it's just more complicated than that. So I could keep going off, but
No, that's actually really interesting. There was a case recently, and I think it was the article you shared of the distance runner from, was it South Africa? Or can you kind of explain that because that kind of goes to the root of what defines a man and what defines a woman, and how when we try to make it that simple, it's not that simple. So if you could share that one.
Yes. So when I talk about Castor Seena, I always lead with Castor Seena is a national treasure. South Africa adores Castor Seena for many reasons. The primary one being that she is proudly who she is, and she refuses to change who she is for other people's ideas of what she should be. And I mean, every South African I've spoken with really wants to talk about Castor Seena and celebrate her athletic genius. Castor Seena had been competing in elite international track and field competitions since she was a teenager, so she was a minor. And the first time she won a global championship, the way that this is talking about how we actually implement these policies, there's unbelievable harm put on people in the way that you try to use these policies. Because how do you determine if somebody potentially might be unfit for the women's category? Whispers, rumors, people's bodies not conforming to some sort of standard of what a woman's body looks like. And so if we present differently, or if we have a lot of muscles, or if we're from the global south, the vast majority of the women whose gender identity has been challenged have been from, it's a problematic term, but Africa and South Asia. Then what happens next? Well, you're whisked away into a room where somebody performs a gynecological exam on you. And I mean, this is what we have been putting women athletes through since at least the 1930s. Again, to prove their fitness, to challenge their notion of themselves and their identity. So Castor Seena was born a woman, raised a woman, always thought of herself as a woman, never even questioned that until this moment. And this happened globally, openly, publicly. People were discussing her gender because her medical exam was leaked to the press. So imagine being 17 years old and the world questioning your identity in that way. And so she learned through the process of this that she had internal testes and that they produced testosterone, and that then she was accused of this being unfair, right? That she shouldn't be allowed to compete with other women. And so kind of moving through this period, for a time, World Athletics, which used to be the IAAF, had a policy that women with high testosterone had to go on medically unnecessary interventions to reduce their naturally occurring testosterone to be woman enough to be eligible for the women's category. And in a book of hers that's coming out next week, and it was excerpted, that's hard to say, in the New York Times over the weekend, she talks about how horrible going on hormonal therapy made her feel. physically, mentally, all of it. She felt miserable for years doing this unnecessary medical intervention to be woman enough to compete in the women's category. She kept winning championships, and then, the World Athletics came up with a new policy that targeted her events only. And so she refused to continue to go on the hormonal therapy, and she tried to race in the events outside of her traditional ones. And it's like, why are we targeting a woman for being excellent? There are genetic factors that make other athletes exceptional, and we celebrate that. There was an Olympic skier who had a genetic mutation where he produced more red blood cells than a typical person would. We didn't say, sorry, you can't compete because you have an unfair advantage. We were like, wow, this is really cool. You're an amazing Olympic multiple-time gold medal winner. And so fortunately, Castor Seena has the support of her country, and she's unapologetically who she is, and she's sharing her story so that future generations of women with elevated testosterone don't have to go through what she's gone through.
Thank you for sort of painting that picture in a more simple way than I've been reading about it. And I want to move on to another subject because I know we don't have a lot of time, but Taylin, for you, because there's a lot of obviously young journalists in this room who are going to have to tackle tough subjects, what would be your advice if you're writing a story like this? Sort of thoughts of how to handle it and what to be prepared for.
Yeah, I actually just had a Zoom interview with a Cronkite student yesterday who had contacted Bill, and Bill referred him to me because he's doing a story on kind of the similar topic of transgender and competing in sports in high school. So I had this long conversation with him yesterday, and I could kind of tell that he was a little nervous after I talked to him and told him about what I've been through. But I mean, if you're interested and if you're passionate about a topic, don't shy away from it, because somebody's gonna have to tell the story. Somebody's gonna have to get that news and that information out there. And I mean, for me, it was never a question of not continuing with the story even after I got pushed back, because I was so passionate about it. So I think just let your passions drive you. I know it sounds really cliche, but if you're interested in doing something, then just go through it. If somebody doesn't want to talk to you, talk to another person. Just keep kind of pushing through it.
And the way I think to get through these conversations in these moments in our sort of history where there's such great divisiveness is to report on these stories and trigger conversations, and just sort of listening to all of these people. I've learned so much about the subject, and education is sort of the key. Lisa, not specifically necessarily about this, but you, in your years as a columnist, have had to write a lot of topics that have been sort of sensitive issues. What's sort of your advice when you're tackling these subjects? I mean, is it erring on the side of sensitivity, or how do you feel about that?
Well, back in the day, the thing that I had tackled a lot was I covered baseball in New York in the 90s, 2000. Steroids was a huge topic then, and I covered the Yankees a lot, and they were big, big boppers. So it was a constant having to ask, either off the record or on the record, are you using, what are you using? And not just those kind of questions, but having to almost not get a medical degree, but have an idea of what I'm talking about with in terms of pituitary gland. And everyone back then thought steroids would just make you bigger, and trying to explain to the average reader or viewer that, no, it's recovery time, things like that. So again, we were not just sports journalists, we're covering all kinds of topics, including medical topics. That 100%. Didn't really answer your question, but
yeah.
It just reminds me of that time. And now it's, human growth hormone and everything has kind of gone away. It's still occurring, obviously, but we don't really report on it that much anymore.
It's interesting, we're almost like anthropologists in our business sometimes, and the subjects that you don't know about are sometimes the most interesting ones to write about or to report on TV, because learning about those makes it interesting. All right, we're going to shift gears. Lisa, we're going to go back. I wanted to talk about, I see some women in here who hope to be, I know some who are sports journalists and hope to continue in that career. When Lisa and I got into the business, it was very different. My first time in a clubhouse was at Dodger Stadium, St. Louis Cardinals clubhouse, and never had been in one before. I walked in the clubhouse, I'm looking for this player. I feel something smack my shoulder, and I look, and a player had thrown a jock strap at me, and it just kind of clung onto my shoulder. I was horrified, and so I remember walking out of that clubhouse thinking, I'm not getting into this career, it's crazy. Fortunately, the player I was looking for came out. He was very nice, but it was different. But people had it far worse, and we won't get into super detail, Lisa, but in 1990, Lisa was working for the Boston Herald, covering the New England, among her assignments, she was covering the New England Patriots, had a horrible incident occur that dramatically altered her next few years of your life. The horrifying part for Lisa's story, and you won't have any trouble finding it online, is it wasn't just backlash from the team, but it was also some backlash from fans, right? I mean, didn't you?
That was the worst part. It wasn't necessarily the team. I was the backup reporter, football reporter, in my first year covering the team. So just to give a little context there, but yeah, it wasn't necessarily, the fan reaction back then is what made it was the cover of Time Magazine, the cover of Sports Illustrated, like on the Today Show and leading the nightly news, and this went on for a long time.
And you were how old? I mean,
I was
like
early 20s.
Early
so I was
20s.
like just probably a couple years out of school. Yeah, and it's a really silly, stupid, what happened to me is I was the only one in the locker room because I caught an earlier flight back from the first game in Indianapolis. I think it was the first game. And all the other reporters were like 2 hours behind me, so I had arranged to do an interview with a cornerback for the Patriots. And the thing to note, even back then, this is 30-something years ago, it's the leagues and the teams that set where we do our job. They tell me, they tell you, whoever it might be, you go into the locker room at this time. You know, you only have a small amount of time. You can only go into a small area of the locker room or changing rooms in Australia, that's what we call them, or the clubhouses. So I was abiding by all of the rules that the team had told me to do, and nonetheless still asked a player to come outside because, like Paola, it was an uncomfortable situation. Also because I was the only reporter there, which is just an anomaly. Usually there'd be 20 reporters there. The player refused to go outside, so I ended up interviewing him, and the whole team not the whole team, but much of the team played a really awful joke on me, naked, trying to get me look at them from this far away. Again, this is where the league and the team told me to do my job. Didn't want it publicized, but our competitor, the Boston Globe, obviously got wind of it a couple days later because players were talking about it. Players were on my side too, but whispering about it. It became, like I said, a national story to the point where I was then covering a Boston Bruins game, and fans literally punched me in my face. I was courtside covering Boston Celtics, and another fan, as I'm on deadline, poured beer on my head. My apartment was broken into with, my walls were all spray painted, something about being a bitch. My car tires were slashed with notes left on them saying, you know, get out of Boston kind of stuff. So I worked for Rupert Murdoch at the time, and he sent me to Australia for what was going to be 6 months just to get away from, they were literally providing 24/7 bodyguards for me to go to games and to be able to leave my apartment safely. The reason, too, is the team kept losing. They ended up going, what was it, a 1-11, I think? So every time they lost a game, it was Lisa Olson's fault. The NFL started doing an investigation in which they hired the people who investigated Watergate to look into this. It took them like 6 months, and players were eventually fined, and the team was fined, and obviously I was, you know, the little that I even said about it, I didn't do any interviews. I think I did one interview with Brian Gumbel, and that was it. My family here in Phoenix was basically not verbally attacked, we'll put it that way, where people were coming to my parents' house and trying to find out information about me. You know, did I sleep with players? Of course not, but that's the rumor that always happens with women. So anyway, I ended up in Australia, which was the greatest thing ever. I stayed for 6 years instead of 6 months. I covered rugby league, rugby union, you know, just cricket. I went all over the world. It was magical, and then ended up New York for 17 years. So it was a really awful thing that happened, but it turned my life around, and I do think in sports, at least with teams, they know that they cannot afford any of that kind of really bad publicity. I mean, the Patriots for a long time, because of that, were a laughing stock. Even the owner, who also owned Remington, ended up, there were boycotts, women's groups organized boycotts against Remington, not just the Patriots, but Remington, and they really took a dive with, financially. So teams definitely learned their lessons. Players, I think now, younger players especially, are so used to seeing women in the business that very rarely do you find things even remotely like that happening, although...
Yeah, so we'll get to this. But that's a great question, or a great point, because I recently asked, one thing I noticed when I've covered the Suns or been over at Suns practices, Devin Booker and Chris Paul, when he was on the team, the respect that they showed women reporters, and I was always really impressed by that. And so I asked their PR person, why are they so nice? And they said she said exactly what you said, because that's all they know. And sometimes that's all it takes for female reporters to be around to know that this is a norm.
Right. When we started, there were maybe a handful of writers and probably 2 people on TV, 2 female, Leslie Visser and maybe, a couple others. But we did not have a lot of role models. And mind you, it was 1977 where it became, equal access became a federal law in which men reporters go into female locker rooms, assuming that female reporters also go in, and vice versa. So whenever anyone asks you, well, why do women get to go into locker rooms and not men go into women's locker rooms, that is not the case at all. It's just that a lot of men do not cover women's sports. So they don't know the difference.
And the women teams for many years are always so grateful for any coverage. They'd go out and talk to the reporters wherever they wanted them to be.
Absolutely.
They made it easier for them. So it's funny, a few minutes before we started talking, Lisa and I were talking and we're like, oh my God, it's so better now. And then we started talking to Taylor and I'm like, we're thinking you don't really deal with much, but you kind of still feel it, don't you? In what ways have you felt it?
I mean, obviously nothing to that extent. But I think it hasn't been so much from teams or from players necessarily, but I got the opportunity to go to the NBA Summer League for Cronkite this past summer. And when I was there, it was just very much, I tried to get onto the court at one point to get pictures. And the security guard kind of gave me a hard time, but would let me on. Kind of would give me a hard time, would let me on. And then afterwards, he told me, he was like, if you weren't so cute, I wouldn't let you onto the court. And I was like, you can just let me onto the court because I would like to do my job. But, I mean, I've gotten little comments like that all the time of like, you're getting this priority because you're cute in journalism, which I mean, can come with a bonus, I guess, because I got the pictures, but that's not what I want to be seen as. I have a master's degree and I've been in school for 5 years, so it is very demeaning to be looked down to like that, but just little things like that, for sure.
And that's where I think it's different, is that a lot of times it's maybe not as blatant as Lisa and I maybe saw it, but there's still sort of these passive-aggressive moments and that things that happen. And I'm trying to remember the story, and Lisa, you can help me a little bit with Houston just a couple of years ago, right? There was a situation with a female reporter. So we're talking about the Houston Astros, a very high-profile organization, females covering the team. And
it was in 2019, this time, playoffs, and the Astros were like the big buzz, big team. And they had a player, a pitcher, who had been suspended for domestic violence. Anyway, he won, he got into a big game. I think he got the save, or he did well. And afterward, in the clubhouse, there was an assistant general manager and other people on the front office of the team in the clubhouse yelling clearly yelling at the female reporters who were gathered around, like 3 or 4 of them, and they were yelling the domestic violence charged pitcher's name and saying, way to go, thank God we got him. And it was clearly to mock the female journalists. Oh, and a couple of them were wearing purple wristbands for domestic violence. The Astros, it became a story. It was written by one of the reporters there. She wrote for Sports Illustrated. The Astros put out this egregious denial, basically accusing her of making up the story. Within 4 days, they had to backtrack. They had to apologize to her because other people also witnessed it, including players who came forward on behalf of the female reporters that they thought were being done wrong. So the guy ended up losing his job. He's basically blacklisted from baseball now, over what you would think is a really stupid thing, yelling, way to go, wife beater kind of thing in front of females. Like, what a way to lose your job. But that is how it's kind of turned around, that the Astros could have taken such an awful publicity hit, and luckily it only took them 4 days to realize, to put out the apologies and to make sure it would never happen again. Now, mind you, in the same series, one of the players in a celebratory, it must have been the championship series that they won, during the champagne thing, literally shoved a champagne bottle up one of the female reporter's skirts. So that's physical assault at your workplace. That too was wasn't brushed under the rug, but the female reporter absolutely, she called me that night and said, I don't want what happened to me to happen to her. Meaning she was afraid she'd get basically chased out of the business if anyone found out this happened to her. And it never really got publicized because they were able to get an apology, and the player profusely apologized, and that was it. But that wasn't that's 4 years ago.
4 years ago.
Still happens.
It's crazy. And there are recent cases with, I think, the Mets and the Cubs, coaches, assistant GMs, who sending inappropriate texts to female
Washington
reporters.
Redskins.
What's that?
The Redskins.
And the Redskins. And
when they were the Redskins, sorry.
yeah, that's right, the team formerly known as the Redskins. What was troubling about those stories to me is that after they came out, there were a bunch of male reporters that said things like, oh yeah, I knew that, or I heard about that, I heard they were getting harassed. But until that moment, they never stepped up. And so this is my plea to the male reporters here. We always have to have each other's backs, whether it's women or men, whatever. We always want to support one another, and that hasn't been the case until recently. I think in the Houston case, there were people around her that said, hey, we witnessed what happened, and that was the truth. So I think surviving, even as a woman in this business, requires a lot of support. So I wanted to bring that up. Victoria, I know you're sort of in the media in a different type of way. You do a lot of interviews and everything. Have you ever sort of felt like, are they looking at me differently because I'm female? Or I know you have the background of a researcher, a historian, an NCAA athlete, but have you always sort of felt treated okay?
Well, I think my athleticism is kind of a shield to this stuff in part, and I'm not excusing it, but there's a respect from athletes and people who work in sports when you've done the things yourself. And this is a standard that is applied to women and not to men, I would say, for the most part. So either I'm oblivious to it, or I do think that plays a role. I do want to kind of, as part of this conversation, point out what had happened at the Women's World Cup over the summer. There were so the Spanish Federation president, if you didn't see the story, without consent, kissed one of the stars of the Spanish team after they won and were celebrating their victory on the lips forcibly. And that was the thing that triggered his eventual downfall, though at first, Spain's leadership was all about supporting him and saying that she initiated and doing all of the things that you don't do. And then the coach, also the manager of the team, Jorge Vilda, was let go as well. This was known for months, years, that there were problems of harassment with the Spanish women's national team, and no one listened. And it took something that egregious for change to happen. So think about if that kiss hadn't happened, what Spanish women's football would be like right now. There were more than 10 players for Spain who did not play in that World Cup, who were the better players called up to the national team who boycotted. So that was kind of like a second team that won the World Cup because of that. And so I think this is an ever-present problem across various parts of sport. And globally, it wasn't just Spain. There were many women's national teams who were desperately trying to bring media attention to their conditions during that tournament.
It's really interesting. We've been talking, and I joked about it earlier, that some people, and I've been seeing a lot of articles that this is the, girl power year, women in sports, and all these great things are happening. And while there have been certain storylines where whether it's soccer players getting more money, you know, a lot of people are paying attention to women's college basketball because some of its elite players, things like that. I don't think we're there yet, as some of these articles are suggesting, and I'm curious, for any of you, where have you seen growth and change with women's sports, and what do you think needs improvement still? I mean, there's so many, but.
Well, I think on a weird level, the fact that I now see men covering women's sports and vying to be like the Mercury beat reporter or something like that, that didn't happen 10 years ago, never mind 25 years ago when the league started. Or to cover ASU volleyball, things like that have changed dramatically. Where it used to be, I mean, we're the toy department, the sports department is, but if you were the lone female on staff, which often happened, you would be assigned to the women's sports, which meant you'd get maybe, if it was newspapers or digital, this much room, or TV, you might get a little segment somewhere. So why would you want, you know, if you care about your job and care about improving and moving on, you don't want to be relegated to covering women's sports. Now it's different. I think now we're realizing, first of all, more women or men that are open to the idea of how we place sports. Do we put, you know, the Diamondbacks obviously ahead of everything right now, but if the Mercury were in the WNBA finals, would they go ahead of the Diamondbacks? There's men that are now thinking along those lines that are making the decisions, and certainly more females in the position to make decisions.
Absolutely. Victoria, how about you?
Well, you know, like I always think historically and I think structurally, you know, there are really interesting things happening at the level of women's professional sports globally and within the United States, with ownership groups, with brand partnerships. People are betting on women's sports in a way that they haven't. And what I mean by that is that they're investing in women's sports. That said, you know, if you take, by comparison, so thinking about structures and institutions, like the NCAA was a men's-only organization for its first 75 years. And so, you know, part of proving compliance with Title IX was moving women's intercollegiate athletics out of PE into the formal athletic department, and then like, well, wouldn't it be easier if the women's teams played in the conference that the men play in? And then like eventually, after trying to fight to kill equal opportunity for women's sports, the NCAA was lobbying, and that means the schools, the NCAA is the schools, they were lobbying to try to get an exemption for athletics from Title IX compliance for almost a decade. When that failed, they launched championships for women's sports. And then the organization that had been doing it, the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, ends up having to fold. That NCAA doesn't let women's sports pick and partner with the brands they want to pick and partner with. And we learned all about this thanks to a law firm having access to NCAA papers, Kapler, Hecker, and Fink, and that was thanks to Sedona Prince's activism, the Oregon basketball player whose viral video exposed the very disparate conditions in a moment when we could actually compare the conditions for the women's tournament and the men's when we were in bubbles during COVID. And so, you know, all of the advancements that we've been seeing in women's professional sports, you know, with standalone women's teams instead of men's teams launching women's teams like Angel City in LA, and others like that, you know, there are women's ownership groups now. They are picking and partnering with corporate brands that are betting on women's sports. And that is something that hasn't been happening to the same degree in the collegiate space, in part because of kind of old structures and conditions that are very hard to chip away at.
Taylin, for you and things that you've in your short sports writing career, because Taylin actually at undergrad at Portland State, right, was not in sports, and then spent a year and a half here, and you're just an amazing writer. But from your sort of short perspective, do you feel like women's sports are where they should be, or are there still things you see lagging behind as far as opportunity and such?
I mean, I think that there's so many levels to it, because you have girls getting flag football programs here in Arizona, which is huge. You have Cameron Brink, a Stanford basketball player who is signed an NIL deal with New Balance and is in these incredible commercials with male athletes. But then being a reporter for ASU, I have been at my fair share of ASU football games and football practices and media availability the first few weeks. And then I decided to shift because I had noticed nobody was writing volleyball stories and nobody was writing women's soccer stories. Women's volleyball is 18-3, I think, right now, like incredible seasons. Women's soccer just got a win over number 11 USC and they're number 24. Like, just huge things are happening for ASU sports, and nobody's talking about it compared to our football team, which is like 0 wins and like 7 losses. So
not pretty.
One. But I kind of took that shift, and it's sad being at a volleyball post practice availability, and it's me and one other reporter, or me being at the women's soccer practice, and it's me and one other reporter, and then me being at football, and it's a packed crowd, a packed audience, a packed parking lot. So I think we have found some steps in the right direction, but obviously there's so much room to grow.
Oh, so I got a couple, before we're gonna open it up to questions in about 5 minutes, but I got a couple questions people sent me who couldn't come, so I'm gonna throw it out, whoever wants to dare take these. One is about NIL deals with women and the decision by some women, I guess for lack of a better expression, to sex it up a little bit with the decision of what they're gonna sell or promote. How do we feel about that? Is that all about feeling confident about body image, or is that a step back for women trying to be taken seriously?
The story is old as time.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I mean, I remember, again, decades ago when females were just starting to get into sports broadcasting, and they'd be mocked if they were in Playboy or did commercials that were kind of out of the norm. And now it's expected that, not the Playboy thing necessarily, but no one really cares what female sports journalists are doing to market themselves.
I mean, you are who you want to present yourself as. And I think if pressure is coming externally, that's one thing, versus if it's how someone wants to develop themselves and their brand, that is how they want to do it. The important piece is companies looking to partner with athletes. Are they going more after athletes who are kind of marketing themselves in what we could call a predictable way, just knowing this history of the pressures placed on women athletes to not be butch historically, that you would play up your heteronormativity and your sexuality so that it was okay that you were good at sports too. And of course, we have such an expansion of gender presentation and sexual orientation. Women have more space to present differently, I would say, than men do in sports. There's a lot more pressures of conformity in the men's side than on the women's. I think it's wise to be who you are and to own it and claim it. And that, that means expansive gender identities and presentations absolutely have a market too. There are a lot of companies that want to signal that they are, embracing of everyone. And, I would tell those athletes to make sure it's a company that is practicing what it's putting out in the world when it comes to being inclusive in that way. But I think brand, had this restriction on athletes being able to monetize their NIL been lifted when the rest of the world had, when the Olympic movement moved away from so-called amateurism, it would have been a lot cleaner than the removal of this, and easier than the removal of this restriction in a social media moment. The Olympics did this in the 80s, and it would have still been hard for athletes and the general public to navigate that transition, but we weren't online then. So, the complications were at a scale that would have been much lower than it is right now.
Lisa, I remember back in the day a lot, but there was a golfer, and I can't remember what her name was, very attractive, who posed like in a bubble bath or something, and it was considered so controversial at the time, right?
Was it Paige?
No, it was one of the early Nancy
right.
Lopez era golfers, and I'll have to think about it. But one thing I've learned, and the greatest thing about teaching at Cronkite, is how much my students keep me in check about like what is old school ideas, and it happens a lot. Taylor, when you hear us talking about like, say the Cavender twins who got an NIL deal and maybe they're posing in selling underwear or whatever, does it make you even blink?
That's so funny because that's what I was going to bring up. Yeah, I think so. It bums me out the most when players like the Cavender twins, they're not that great of athletes. They're pretty girls. They're talented enough to be playing Division I basketball where they are, but they are no Cameron Brink. They're no, they're not going to do anything after this. But they're being approached with NIL deals because they are cute girls and they're twins. So I think those are the circumstances that do bum me out because it's not being projected to the right people who deserve them, who work at the sport and actually are passionate about the sport and want shoe deals and they want brand deals instead of this idea that sex sells. So that is kind of a bummer to me in that aspect.
And it also sometimes brings up the issue of race. They're cute white blonde girls, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's something we've seen happen forever, and you would think we see that changing a little bit. But that's, I think, I'm so glad you brought that up because I also think that's another part of this storyline that bugged me a little bit. So that was a good question. All right, last one, then we'll get to questions here, and you can just come up to the mic if you're ready for a question. And this kind of goes a little bit off the charts, but someone is asking do you think the public will finally get used to hearing women do play-by-play on men's sports? If anyone thinks Doris Burke doesn't do a great job, you can leave now. I think she's amazing. I'm kidding. But, I mean, there is a comfort level sometimes with voices, right? We're trained to understand a lot of play-by-play and broadcast voices are deeper. But do any of you have any thoughts on that? Is that going to change?
I think of my grandfather, who would always have opinions about women's voices. He only liked John Madden, so nobody else could compete with John Madden. But, now I don't hear that from my nephew who's 9. He doesn't care. So, yeah, it's just the evolution of people who are watching, basically. And our ears changing, our ears getting used to different voices.
It's an adjustment, yeah. Either of you?
I would just say, like, the diversity of people working in all parts of sports has been around long enough now that this generational change, this generation of athletes who don't bat an eye at women working in any part of the sports industry and is likely partly explained by many of them might have had moms who were more athletic than their dads. And, maybe they practiced basketball more with their mom than they did with their dad, or
watch games with
or watched exactly the fandom piece too. So this change over time had been long and slow and quick in the more recent past for sure.
Awesome. Any more, Taylor? Yeah.
I mean, I think I would say the same thing of it's very generational and the younger audience is a lot more in tune to it. It's what we grew up hearing, like Doris Burke has been an announcer since I can remember watching basketball.
Awesome.
But but there's also that older audience that I've heard say a woman can't announce a men's sport because they haven't played it and they don't know. It's a different pace, it's a different style of play, it's a different game. So you get both aspects, but I think it's very much evolved in where we're going.
100%.
I was never a criminal, but I could cover crime. That's the only response. I was never a politician, but I could cover politics, kind of thing.
Yes. It's that one always amazes me, and there are a fair amount of men out there who are in the same situation, but they don't bring that part up. So, okay, I want to open it up for questions. You can ask anything, whether it's about transgender athletes, we can about women in sports media, where women's sports are going. On that final note, real quick, I do want to remind the women that are here, because we were talking about play-by-play and color. Take a chance if you've never done it before. I know that a lot of women come in here and it's awesome. They want to be sideline reporters. They want to be on air. Consider play-by-play. Consider being a color analyst. There are a lot of great opportunities here at Cronkite, and I know some of you are doing that already, but don't be afraid to try. All right, who's going to be brave and ask the first question? I know. Okay.
I will.
Okay, all right, go ahead. Yeah. Right there, yeah, go to the mic.
I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts. What are your opinions on like the Leah Thomas story from a few years ago of her being a transgender woman participating in women's sports, a lot of controversy, complaints from maybe opponents, news media. What do you guys think about that? Go ahead. Because I think Caitlyn Jenner, also who is also a former athlete, decathlon, said that she doesn't think that trans women should participate in women's sports.
Okay.
This was a mess of the NCAA's own making, is the kind of first way I would answer this. So the NCAA is a school sports organization. That's why they don't pay football players. It's an educational program serving athletes. And there's a lot of kind of arguments in both directions that come from the NCAA. This would be an example of that. And so school sports in the United States must comply with federal educational civil rights laws, which mean equal access and opportunity to participate in education programs and activities. And so the NCAA had a transgender inclusive policy in place for more than a decade with no problems. There have been transgender athletes participating in college sports for years, and nobody made a mess of it or decided to hold protests and boycotts. Transgender athletes in sports became a culture wars thing. And so, these exceptional people who were not on the radar of people with a culture wars agenda, they found a very easy target in Leah Thomas. People who did not follow NCAA swimming, or who, have been going to swim meets for a long time. So setting aside the athletes and elite athletes and athletes with celebrity profiles who've spoken out on this. And so that inclusive policy, Leah Thomas was complying with it, and it was lowering her testosterone below a certain limit for a certain period of time. The reason I say the NCAA messed this up is that we have a elite sports and school system within the United States, and these are education programs. We have an Olympic movement with the IOC at the top. The IOC was developing its transgender policies and revisiting them coming off the Tokyo Games. They decided to kick it to the federations, sport by sport. So the international federations, the fundamental baseline needed to be inclusion. They must find means of including transgender athletes to have participation opportunities. And so whether that was, bringing hormonal levels down below a certain level for a certain period of time, or creating a third category of competition, or whatever that was, they first needed to have scientific proof that there was a disproportionate advantage, and then they needed to have a policy of inclusion. Swimming, so the International Federation for Swimming, saw people within that organization, these are people who run these bodies, and World Athletics, it's Sebastian Coe, and within swimming, they designed a new policy that seemed strangely specific to Leah Thomas's timeline. They expanded the time for which you needed to be on hormones to 36 months. And then the NCAA, following this controversy, was like, we're lifting our inclusive policy that we've had in place and has been working forever, and we're going to go sport by sport and follow the federations too. So this actually makes the schools vulnerable for being out of compliance with Title IX and vulnerable to lawsuits because of that, by following international sports policies instead. And so Leah Thomas was just shy of reaching a 36-month period of being on hormones. That's why I say it felt specifically targeted to her, kind of like Castor Seena in World Athletics. And so the NCAA, she found this out weeks before the national championships. And so the NCAA was like, okay, well, this is the policy now, but we'll give you an exemption. Well, that's not going to go over well for people who are kind of manipulating and taking advantage of a culture wars moment to get their agenda through state legislatures and, you know, win elections on this and that sort of thing. We've had a slew of GOP candidates announce their run for presidency, leading with transgender women in sports. Talon has really good statistics on the representation of transgender athletes in sports in her piece.
What was it, like 0.0006, I think?
0.0006 transgender athletes compared to the number.
And it's like, what harm is being incurred by Leah Thomas participating? Like, this is the piece that I'm like, I don't understand what you're trying to say. Like, who is being harmed by someone competing in the category they've been meeting all of the requirements to participate in a scholastic setting? Now, if the NCAA wants to pay football players and recognize their employee rights and come up with new models for sports and say this is professional and outside of a scholastic educational model, then that's a different story. And maybe, you know, the NCAA should be following the International Federation policies. So I think, again, it was like an own goal. Like, you made a hot mess of this and made it much worse than it should have been, and your charge is to protect the most vulnerable athletes. And educational, and all civil rights laws are about protecting the most vulnerable, marginalized groups. And gender identity and sexual orientation are part of the list of identities that are protected in our body of civil rights laws in the US. So again, like, you're making these schools vulnerable by potentially being in violation of those laws when you're acting in these ways. That was a long, messy,
That was good.
complicated answer.
That was really good. Alex, I think you had one back there. Alex, come up to the mic. Come on down.
So another and similar question, another unfortunate byproduct of kind of dichotomizing sports to men's sports and women's sports and doing it based off, you know, hormone levels or whatever it is it doesn't include non-binary people. And we know that there are non-binary people in sports. I think like an American figure skater is going to be the first Winter Olympian in Beijing. And so I'm curious as to, you know, what you think the future of maybe legislating that is, as well as, you know, coverage. I don't know if the AP style book mentions non-binary people or has guidelines around that, so I'm curious as to your thoughts.
Well, maybe the evolution is that instead of just having men and women's sports, we now have 3 categories or 4 categories, and we have to evolve.
Yes. So I spoke with Bobby Lancaster on this, guided to me by Paola. For those of you that don't know who Bobby is, she is a trans athlete. She transitioned very late into her life. She has been playing golf forever. She was the first trans person to be on the LPGA and compete in the LPGA tour. I had about an hour-long phone call, and I actually asked her that question at the end, and I said, where do you think we go from here? Because it's not so cut and dry. We can't get to a conclusion. Testosterone levels are always going to be altering. We're always going to be moving up the circumstances and what we need to do. And she said the same thing of, we need to create a new sport. We need to create a different way, like a different genre of male, female, trans, non-binary are in one category. Female are in their own category, male are in their own category, because we just haven't been able to get to this level of compliance with each other and how we want to monitor it. And then, I mean, it was also talked about in an article that I read. I don't know if this is the way to go, but instead of there being a WNBA and an NBA, let's make this fun little league or this fun little tournament that sees Taurasi playing alongside LeBron James, and it's like boys and girls and non-binary folks and trans folks, and it's just kind of, we're playing the game that we love. So that's what I was talking about with Bobby, and that's what I've read a little bit about, so yeah.
I'd watch that league, by the way. That sounds fun. Do you have anything to add on that? Or-
I mean, there are people in charge of sports that are legacy sports that, you know, I think differ from what we see in other sports or new sports, and opportunities and potential for, you know, like an ultimate Frisbee being something where there's no gender categories of competition, there had been Olympic events that were not separated into two participation categories, and I think this demonstrates a legacy sport way of thinking about bodies and ability that's really telling. And so, you know, trap and skeet shooting is an Olympic event, and there was just one category of a competition open to everyone, and from the beginning. So the first time that event was on the Olympic program was in Mexico City in '68, the best Olympics for looking historically at an Olympic event. And maybe this sounds predictable, but in the Barcelona 1992 Olympics, a woman won. And what do you think happened next after a woman won skeet shooting at the Olympic Games? Something changed. That's a hint. What do you think happened? Yes? Yes. So I ask this question a lot, and that is what I get in response every time, that they establish two categories of competition, one for men and one for women. What happened is worse. They made it men's only, and so at Atlanta in 1996, the defending gold medalist couldn't defend her gold medal because there was no category of competition for her to compete in. And then making it worse yet again, at the next Summer Olympic Games in Sydney in 2000, they created a new event that was part of their expanding opportunities for women in sport, which was a new women's skeet shooting competition. It's like, that is not the narrative that happened here. And she competed in those Olympics 8 years later. So yeah, so thank you for playing the game where I set someone up to fail. I'm sorry for that. But yeah, so I think that's a good story of exposing our expectations for bodies and abilities in sports. There are certain sports that women are going to be better than men at. Olympic, the flying, the ski jump event, where they fly, women's bodies are aerial more so than men's bodies. And out of the safety for women from protection for harm, women could not participate in ski jumping. And women who did the event but couldn't do it at world championships for the federation or at the Olympic Games were like suspecting that the reason why was that they might be outperforming the men. And so it took a long time to finally get that on the program, and it's a circular logic. Well, it has to be at a world championships before it's on the Olympic program, coming from the IOC and then from the federation. Well, it needs to be an Olympic event before it can be in the world championships, and it's like, yeah. So anyway, that's a long roundabout way of kind of pointing out our often the kind of baggage we carry when we think about sporting bodies and who's inherently better and who's inherently weaker. Part of it is the design of the sport itself.
I'm so into when, we'll wrap it up here, but I so watch the PGA now when there are women competing, and I think it's happened, 4 or 6 times. And the last time was just a week or two ago, and she just missed the cut, but had a far better score than almost half the field. And so I love to see that. Breakdancing is going to be in the Olympics in Paris. I'm very fired up. I love breakdancing. I don't know, though, if it's going to be, I don't know if it's combined or what, so we'll have to look into that, have to dig into that. Anyway, we have passed our time, actually. I really appreciate all of you coming out. Again, I know 5 to 6 in the middle of the week. There's a lot of other stuff going on, and it means a lot to all of us that you came, and also to my awesome colleagues here and friends to do this. Thank you.
Thany you, Paula, for all you do. You're like this beacon at ASU.
I just stand up here with the mic. I know a lot of you will be working on stories for classes, I'm sure, whether it's digital broadcast. I'm sure all of them wouldn't mind if you need sources sometimes to reach out. I can always help you reach out to them. I'm in the sports bureau back there all the time, and so I'm sure they would all be okay with being interviewed. So thank you again very much.